This video is sponsored by me and you. Find out more at the end. Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Aladdin or Aladdin. I make videos talking about Islam critically, hence the need for anonymity. And by the end of this video, I hope to have demystified the Quran and demonstrated that it's a lot less eloquent and wise than it is touted to be. For those of you who don't know, the Quran is Islam's holy book. It is considered by Muslims to be the word of Allah, aka God, and a guidance for all of mankind, despite only being revealed in one language to one messenger, Muhammad. It is written primarily in a dialect of Arabic that Muhammad spoke, and Muslims are supposed to pray and recite Quran in Arabic only. Any translations are deemed inadequate and are said to not capture the eloquence of the Quran. And despite the majority of Muslims not speaking or understanding Arabic, most of them will learn enough Quran to pray with it, or would learn how to sound out Arabic words but not really understand them. And despite all that, many Muslims boast about the Quran's perfection and beauty, citing claims that come from the Quran itself and are validated by those who believe it. It's a bit circular, isn't it? The Quran is perfect because it says so, and because Muslims say so, and anyone who disagrees is a disbeliever and their opinion is irrelevant. And you know what? If Islam was some pacifist or inconsequential religion, I wouldn't go out of my way to debunk such a bold claim. I mean, I don't go to a pizza place and argue about their best pizza in town sign, but Islam is far from that. But Muslims can be a bit arrogant about this claim and even using it to somehow prove the religion true. The Quran is said to be perfect, without any mistakes or contradictions. Not only that, but it's so linguistically eloquent and beautiful that it cannot be replicated by humans, hence supposedly proving that it came from God. In fact, there are verses in the Quran that challenge humans to bring a verse like it. And I made a whole video about the subjective and self-fulfilling nature of such a challenge, so you can watch that later. Today I want to focus on the claim that the Quran is perfect, which is a claim that all Muslims are supposed to believe, and pretty much most of them do, even the ones who cannot read or understand it. If you don't understand Arabic, and even if you do, it can be pretty daunting to assess such a claim, let alone challenge it, because you'd be gaslit by the masses who oppose you. But by definition, the defenders of the Quran are incapable of conceding to any flaw or oddity in it. So don't let that deter you, just read it with an open mind. And let's try to be objective here. Proving perfection is impossible. It's not enough for 1 billion or more people to claim something like a book is perfect. And it's not enough for all the Muslim scholars in the world to claim that it's perfect either. And no amount of scholars of language or theology making that claim makes it true. Perfection by its very nature is the absence of flaw. So to prove perfection, we would have to go through every verse and check that it is not imperfect, which is not only a tedious process, but also very subjective. Lucky for us, imperfection is way easier to prove than perfection. All we need to find is one flaw, one mistake or one contradiction, or even one verse or part of it that could be written better. So I'm going to simplify the process of investigating perfection. We don't need to analyze the entire book. All we need to do is stumble upon one flaw. I mean, where do I even begin? The Quran is not well organized at all. It's not in any particular order that we know of, and every chapter contains verses that are disconnected and stories that span multiple chapters with no clear connection between them. And the whole book is devoid of context and meaning without a pile of secondary sources and scholarly interpretation, which are absolutely full of flaws and discrepancies. Even Muslims agree that the human interpretation is flawed and that the secondary sources have flaws in them. But if the book can only be interpreted through flawed channels, is the book perfect? Is God incapable of creating a book that references itself and has enough context for you to understand without human interpretation? But let's put all of that aside from now and let's read some Quran together. From the beginning of the Quran, if we skip the first chapter and go directly to the second, the first 18 verses have at least 4 very questionable verses. So let's go through Surah Al-Baqarah together. The first verse says, Alif Lam Mim. Those are 3 letters of the Arabic word, as if I said A-L-M. They don't really mean anything and no one knows what they mean, but Muslims somehow think that it is a miracle. This interpretation, for example, this tafsir says, these letters are one of the miracles of the Quran and none but Allah alone knows their meanings. I don't understand how it's a miracle if nobody knows what it means, but as you can see, the definition of miracle is pretty loose in Islam. This is not the only chapter that contains such a verse with a bunch of random letters, but that's not important right now. If I were to give you a series of letters, say TCTFY, whether or not they mean something that is not a miracle. By the way, they do mean something, so if you crack the code, let me know in the comments below. The one way that I find this verse valuable is that it helps the Quran rhyme, but beyond that, it adds nothing to the meaning. The second verse says, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. This is the book, meaning the Quran, whereof there is no doubt, guidance to those who are al-muttaqeen, the pious believers of Islamic monotheism who fear Allah much. Not much I want to say about that, it just asserts that there is no doubt in the Quran. Verse 3 says, who believe in the unseen and establish worship and spend of that we have bestowed upon them. Isn't it funny how believing in stuff you cannot see and cannot confirm usually is called gullibility, and it's not something they should be praised for? But in the context of religion and here in the context of Islam, it's something that God really values. Why does God value blind faith? And who believe in that which is revealed unto thee, Muhammad, and that which was revealed before thee, and are certain of the hereafter. What about all these people? These depend on guidance from their Lord. These are the successful. It's kind of a common theme in the Quran. These are the best of you, these are the worst of you, these are the good people, these are the bad people. But it's not really convincing someone who doesn't believe. It's just telling people that their in-group is good and the out-group is bad, as we're going to see in a second. As for the disbelievers, whether thou warn them or thou warn them not, it is all one for them, they believe not. This one's a bit confusing to me because here there is no context that says God is speaking about a specific group of disbelievers that he knows whether or not Muhammad would warn them, it wouldn't make a difference. It's a general disbeliever. So is Allah saying that disbelievers will not believe no matter what you say to them? Does that mean that it is predetermined what their belief will be or will not be? I've said this before a million times. People don't choose their beliefs, even Muslims. And I made a whole video about this. This is a concept that is detrimental to Islam altogether. The idea of a kafir, a believing disbeliever, or someone who chooses to disbelieve. And you can watch that later. So yeah, in verse 6, Allah saying, it doesn't make a difference, disbelievers are going to disbelieve. Do we even have free will? Verse 7 says, Allah hath sealed their hearing and their hearts, and on their eyes there is a covering. Theirs will be an awful doom. وَلَهُمْ عَذَابٌ عَظِيمٌ, and they will be tortured severely. Again, this is a bit confusing. So Allah has sealed their hearts? Is it their fault that Allah has sealed their hearts? I know that the apologetic argument is that Allah seals their heart only because they have chosen to disbelieve, so it's after their choice Allah intervenes and seals their heart. But why is he doing anything at all? And is he actually doing something? I mean, from an outsider's perspective, if someone says, I don't believe you, and then you say, abracadabra, I did some magic and now you're never going to believe me again. Is that really doing anything, or is that just a cope to say that, I didn't want you anyway? It's kind of like incels who get really angry when they get rejected and they say, screw you, I didn't want you anyway, you suck. It's the same vibe. And this is not the only verse or chapter where God comes off as someone who's really upset that you don't listen to him or you don't believe in him. So he just says, you're doomed, I've already sealed your heart. But when you think about it, is God really the most merciful, the most wise, the most knowing, all these labels, if he then just makes things worse for you? So if you believe in God, sure, he's going to guide you, he's going to help you, and he's going to move the doubts away from you. But if you don't believe in God, it's almost like a snowball effect where instead of just watching you struggle, at least that would be God not intervening, God makes things worse by sealing your heart so that you will never believe. Who's the real devil in this situation? I mean, pause and think about it. God is not just passively watching as people don't believe and then punishes them for it. God makes sure that they'll never believe again and then punishes them extra for it. Verse 10 drives that point home, but we'll get to that in a second. Verse 8 says, and of mankind are people who say, we believe in Allah and the last day, when they actually don't believe. God is talking about the munafiqeen, the hypocrites. They think to deceive Allah and those who believe, but they deceive none except themselves, but they do not perceive that. So Muhammad was really paranoid about this idea of people who don't actually believe, but say that they believe either for political gain or just to benefit from being near him or whatever the case may be. And that sort of paranoia really shows in the Quran. He's always talking about the hypocrites. And I want you to think about the percentages of hypocrites, disbelievers, believers, and that sort of classification. The Quran seems to focus heavily on the bad people and not really representatively talking about the in-betweeners or the good people. I mean, goodness is only in belief. There is no such verse about and the people who don't actually believe, but they're kind of chill, or the people who tell you that they don't believe and they actually didn't do anything wrong. That doesn't exist in the Quran. Is either good people believe, Bad people disbelieve, and there are pretenders, and they're out to get the Muslims, or they're out to get Muhammad, or whatever the case may be. And I truly wonder, what was life like around Muhammad? Why was he so paranoid and jaded? Where are all the people who just don't believe? And because history is written by the victors, I wonder if there were people who Muhammad would consider to be hypocrites, but maybe they're not doing it for political gain. Maybe they're doing it because if they don't join the ranks of the Muslims, then they'll either be enslaved or killed or something else. I just have to wonder, why is Quran not representative of reality? Why do we have to keep reading these verses about hypocrisy and hatred when in reality most people don't believe because it's not convincing? Anyway, moving on, verse 10. This is also another interesting verse. In their hearts is a disease, and Allah increased the disease. A painful doom is theirs because they lie. Allah is not just observing someone with a disease in their heart. Allah is amplifying that disease. And I ask you, is Allah the devil? It's like once you reach a certain point, Allah cannot help you. Allah only makes it worse for you. If, like Allah says in a previous verse, it doesn't matter what you tell people, they're going to disbelieve anyway, and they have a disease in their heart and Allah is making it worse, and Allah is choosing for them to have that fate, how much choice do we really have? And the author of the Quran, supposedly Allah, seems to really relish in this idea that people will be tortured and their torture will be amplified by Allah's contribution to the process. Is Allah a sadist? And I'm not explaining all this to cry, this is unfair, why is Allah not helping me? I'm not protesting the unfairness as if it's real. I'm demonstrating the absurdity of the premise and its clearly imperfect and unfair nature, which I think disproves all claims that Allah is the most merciful and the most wise and all that kind of stuff. And keep in mind that people's good deeds only count if they're done in the name of Allah. So if you're someone who doesn't believe in Islam, or if you're a Muslim but you're doing things out of the goodness of your heart, I don't think it really counts unless you're doing it with the intention to please Allah. You could be a great person who does a lot of charity and is just nice to people around them and just doesn't do sins or evil deeds. But as long as you don't believe in Allah, you deserve the worst of torture. Where's the fairness? And this idea of labeling people as good, bad, believer, disbeliever, munafiqeen, hypocrites, it's kind of like the communist scare in Cold War America, where anyone that you wanted to politically assassinate or anyone you didn't like or anyone you were suspicious of, you would call a communist. And I think the word munafiq is used kind of in a similar way. If you call someone a munafiq, then they cannot be trusted. Even if they outwardly say, I'm a Muslim, and they go to the mosque and everything, if you distrust them because of these verses, then they're the out group. The concept of in and out group is not exclusive to Islam. It's actually present in a lot of high control groups and cults, but that's a story for another time. And a lot of these verses read to me not as a wise God telling us how to believe in him or why should people follow Islam. It's just, you'll be tortured if you don't, and just dissing people who don't believe. It's absurd. There's even a verse where the author, supposedly God, calls someone a bastard, essentially a illegitimate child. Bastard bitch! Which, I don't care what that person did to Muhammad, or if he actually did anything. How is it their fault to what their parents did before they were born? Again, it reads less like a god and more like a man who's really angry.
If you want to go, then you go to hill and go down.
There are some characters that we only know by these nicknames that Muhammad or the people around him gave for them. For example, Musaylama al-Kadhab, literally translating to Musaylama the liar. I mean, imagine a reality where 20 years from now, you open the American history textbooks and you read Sleepy Joe, the name that Donald Trump would call Joe Biden, and that's the official title. That's kind of what Islam is sometimes. It feels like a political hit piece. Let me know in the comments below if you'd like me to make a video about a chapter that is essentially a diss track against one of Muhammad's enemies. Anyway, verse 11 says, "And when it is said unto them, make not mischief in the earth, they say, we are peacemakers only." Another translation would say, and when they are told don't corrupt the land, they say, no, we are actually fixers. Which is funny because I can see how that kind of rhetoric could apply to me. I mean, Muslims say that I'm spreading corruption in the land, and I say that, no, actually I'm trying to help people. So this applies to me. And again, I show you how this is designed to just put people in the out group. Because really, who defines what is corruption in the land? If someone says, I am a polytheist and I want to talk about my religion, a Muslim can perceive that as spreading corruption in the land. Or if someone says, I have an interpretation of Islam that is a little different than the mainstream and I would like to spread that, other Muslims might interpret that as spreading corruption in the land. Verse 12 says, "Are they not indeed the mischief makers, but they perceive not?" So if they don't perceive it, are they accountable for it? Really, if someone thinks that they're doing something good, but it's actually something bad, isn't the intention what counts if Allah knows what's in the heart? Verse 13 says, "And when it is said unto them, Believe as the people believe, they say, Shall we believe as the foolish believe? Are they not indeed the foolish, but they know not?" Which just reads like, no, you're the foolish ones. It's kind of petty, but also it mirrors how Muslims look at other faiths. I'm not saying that every Muslim is rude about other beliefs, but essentially they think, that's silly, I wouldn't believe in that. Polytheism, for example, it seems really so far-fetched to a Muslim. Monotheism makes a lot of sense, and they would say, why would I follow that foolish religion? But they don't realize that people can view their religion that way. So is it really fair of Allah to punish and torture and discredit and demonize people who don't believe in Islam when that's exactly how Muslims think of other religions? Is it really beyond the realm of possibility that a good person would not believe in Islam? Verse 14 says about the hypocrites again, "And when they fall in with those who believe, they say, We believe. But when they go apart to their devils, they declare, We are with you. Verily, we did but mock." Again, I ask, why is the Quran always representing the most extreme examples that may or may not even exist? Like they have this caricature of a person who is just an enemy of Muslims and Allah and mocks them in secret while pretending to be one of them in person. In reality, the only time I've ever seen someone do that is when they're forced to be Muslim, and the only catharsis that they get is talking about it critically or satirically in private. But that's only because they have to behave Muslim in public. If Islam didn't demonize anyone who didn't believe, a lot more people would just be open about not believing instead of having to pretend and then mock in secret. There's always that black and white portrayal of like intentionally evil people who deceive and mock and belittle, when in reality it's never that simple. So is this book representative of the nature of man or the world we live in? Or is it representative of the paranoid mind of a man or a group of people who wanted to keep the power that they held over the people? Verse 15 says, "Allah mocks them and prolongs their transgression while they wander blindly." Again, I ask, why is Allah prolonging their transgression, making it worse so then He can torture them worse? Why isn't He either not intervening or actually helping? And it's the same silly mentality of, you're making fun of me? No, I make fun of you. Come on, God, it's kind of beneath you. Verse 16 says, "These are they who purchase error at the price of guidance, so their commerce doth not prosper, neither are they guided." Essentially, they made a bad choice. Verse 17 I find very, very interesting for multiple reasons. مَثَلُهُمْ كَمَثَلِ الَّذِي اسْتَوْقَدَ نَارًا. Their example is like the example of a man who lit a fire. And I'm translating this slowly so you follow with me. فَلَمَّا أَضَاءَتْ مَا حَوْلَهُ. When the fire illuminated what is around him, ذَهَبَ اللَّهُ بِنُورِهِمْ وَتَرَكَهُمْ فِي ظُلُمَاتٍ لَا يُبْصِرُونَ. Allah took their light and left them in darkness they cannot see. What's confusing here is that the example that Allah is supposedly giving doesn't make sense at all. And also it switches between talking about one person and a group of people. So their example is like the example of a man who lights up a fire. When the fire illuminates what's around him, Allah takes their light. Who is there referring to? Well, there is referring to the hypocrites as a group, not the man in the example, which is a bit confusing. Almost as if the author kind of forgot halfway that they're given an example about one person. But of course, the tafsir, the exegesis, has an explanation for this, because it's not the first or the last time that this happens in the Quran. And they have created a category for this kind of thing so that it's not a mistake. It's called iltifat. And they say that it's useful for highlighting or emphasizing a certain point. But I'm not really sure what point this is supposed to emphasize. It just makes things more confusing. It doesn't really add any value. But even if we fix this, if we say their example is like the example of those who lit up a fire, when the fire illuminated what was around them, Allah took their light and left them in darkness. Why did Allah take their light? In this analogy or example that Allah is giving, the person didn't do anything. They just lit up a fire and they were able to see, and Allah just took it like a jerk. So it's not really representative of the situation that he's describing. If he wanted to give a better analogy, he would say maybe their actions turned off that fire, or because of their sins, they didn't realize that they lost that light that they need. Instead, it's just Allah turning off the light. Verse 18 says, صُمٌّ بُكْمٌ عُمْيٌ فَهُمْ لَا يَرْجِعُونَ. Deaf, dumb, and blind, and they return not. And this verse is a favorite of a lot of Muslims who really, really dislike disbelievers or ex-believers or critics of Islam. But I just wonder, why is it so ableist? Who created deaf, mute, and blind people except you, Allah? Allah makes sure that they're deaf, mute, and blind so that they don't return. Why does He intervene in a negative way? There's more that could be said about these verses and others, so if you'd like me to make more videos discussing some verses, let me know which ones in the comments below. I really don't want you to be dissuaded by people who say that you need to understand Arabic or you must have a PhD in Islamic theology to be qualified to assess whether or not this is a good book. If you pick it up and you go through the proper channels of finding as much context and explanation as you can, and you still find flaws, then you have found a flaw. I mean, I consider it a flaw when a book focuses too much on God's feelings and how He's hurt that people don't believe in Him over actually giving us evidence that He exists. I find it to be a flaw that God Himself, supposedly in His last and most important communication with humans, calls everyone who doesn't find this convincing or compelling names. I find it a flaw when God gives an example that doesn't really make sense or doesn't add any more information, and an example that references the wrong number of people. I find it a flaw when a book is very divisive and makes people paranoid about those around them. My point is, pick up the book yourself, read it, don't take anyone else's word for it. Don't believe the promoters or even the believers who tell you that it's a beautiful and eloquent and wise book. I'm sure there's a lot in it that's not too bad, but there's also a lot in it that's not all that great. Let me know what you think. If you like this video, hit the like button, leave a comment below. I'm trying this new unscripted format, so let me know what you think of it. And a special thank you to my patrons, YouTube members, and donors for helping me get to where I am today and supporting this channel. I cannot do this without you. If you'd like to support me, links are in the description below. And as always, think critically and think for yourself. And consider reading the Quran. It's actually kind of entertaining.